Hello, it's Thursday, so it's time for another CleveTech Tech Tips video. Today we're going to look at guide height setup and how it affects the pickup and handling of your slot car. So we're going to start with some of the things we're going to use. So we need our guide, we need a selection of guide washers, our guide nut, we need a digital caliper, and we need the actual car we're going to set our guide up on, and a block with a slot in it. So I'm going to be using this Genesis chassis that you might have seen in my previous video. I'm also going to be using a prepared HP guide. I've got a Cahosa guide as well for a reference. So let's start. So we can start by taking a measurement on our freshly prepared guide. This guide is prepared exactly as I want to race it, with the right braids in. It's all finished off, etc. So if you want to see how to prepare a guide like this, have a look at one of my other videos. I'll put a link on the screen very soon. So we're going to start measuring it. We're measuring between the point where the guide is going to go up against the guide tab and where the braids are actually going to touch the track. So let's see how thick our guide is. There we go. So 78.5 thou, call that 79 thou. And check the other side. 79 thou. Now, with the way I prepare my braids, they become slightly thicker at the rear of the braid. That is why I am measuring it right at the rear of the braid. If your braids were slightly shorter in your guide, then you might want to measure it slightly closer into the guide post itself. But ultimately, you will need to measure from that little ridge that runs around the guide post to the bottom of your braids at the thickest point. Next thing I'm going to do is to measure the position of the guide tab in relation to the bottom of the chassis. So how high does the guide tab sit above the track when the chassis is resting on the track? So again, I use my digital calipers. I can use the depth part at the bottom, and I can put that onto the guide tab and push that down until it hits the bottom of the chassis. And then we'll have a look at our measurement, and we can see it is 89 thousandths of an inch. When you've taken your two measurements of the guide and the height of the guide tab, now the height of my guide tab was 89 thou from the bottom of the chassis. The thickness of my guide with braid was 79 thou, so we've got a 10 thou difference there. So I'm going to take my 10 thou washer, actually it's that one, 10 thou washer, put that onto my guide. Rest the chassis on top, and then this is where it's handy to have a block with a slot in it. So I can put my chassis on my plate, make sure my guide's there, and then I can just check to see, does the front of the chassis sit nicely on this block without any rock? And now, yes, it does. Now, it's very hard to show in a video, so I've taken a photograph of that, and I will put that on the screen now. Now, that is what I call the zero height of my chassis or my guide. So from that point on, I can either put more washers in to raise the chassis, or I can reduce my washers to lower the chassis or raise the guide. Now, there's various reasons why you would want to do that. Some tracks have braid that is recessed below the track surface. When that is the case, if you set your car up to its zero height, then you would find that the chassis would be running on the track, yet the guide might be in the air slightly, and the braids might not be touching the braid of the track or the contact rails of the track very, very well. So that might affect the contact of your braids onto your track and therefore your power to your motor. Now you may have noticed I've got no lead wires on here, just basically because it was easier to show you the video without the lead wires in place. Some tracks have rails on or have tape on the track, which is actually slightly above the track surface. In that case, I'd probably want to use a 5 thou washer or even no washers at all, so that the guide could in fact be raised so that the chassis could still run very, very close to the track. Now, the same thing applies if you've got front wheels on your car, because you don't want the front wheels on your car in the air, because then the car will do a lot of tipping on the track. Now, when the car tips, that can obviously cause your back wheel to tip and move, therefore reducing the amount of grip you have at the rear of your car. It all depends on how flexible the chassis is, I suppose, but in most cases, if your car is tipping around, then that can affect your grip at your rear. It also affects the way the weight of the car moves and can actually have an adverse effect on the handling of the car. However, for some of the racing I do, where the rubber from the tyres builds up quite a lot on the track, then sometimes raising the front of your car so that the front of the chassis doesn't actually touch the track can be a good thing, because then the front of the car is not running through loads and loads of the rubber that's left on the track and dragging a lot on the track. So you can actually improve the handling and speed of your car by raising the front of your chassis slightly. The other thing that can affect the guide height, or how you want to set your guide height, could be how smooth the track is. Now, I could be talking about the track surface, but I could also be talking about the flatness of the braid on the track, or the contact rails, or the tape on the track. Because sometimes you want to use the braid on your car to give a little bit of movement to take up any bumps or any inconsistencies in the track. If the track's nice and smooth, you could probably run your front wheels or your chassis very, very low to the track, so that the chassis or the front wheels are running over the track all the time. There's virtually no tip in the chassis, and it should be fairly smooth to drive around the track. If the track's fairly bumpy, or the braid is very bumpy on the track, then you might want to raise the front of your chassis slightly. If the track surface is very smooth, then you might want to consider running the front of your chassis actually on the track surface, or your front wheels directly onto the track surface, because then you can actually rely on the track to help guide the chassis around the corners so that there's no tip in the chassis. However, if the track is very bumpy, then you might want to consider slightly raising the front of your chassis off the track surface so that the front of the chassis doesn't get caught on any bumps or the whole car gets upset by vibrations on the track surface. But that does rely on the braid or the contact rail being fairly smooth. On some tracks, you have quite a smooth track surface, but the braid or the contact rail is very bumpy, in which case you probably want to remove washers and in effect raising the guide so that, and running a bit more spring in your braid so that it takes up the inconsistencies and the bumps in the contact. The other thing to note is when you do actually put the whole thing together and you screw your guide nut down on top, you will find there will be a slight fluctuation in how the guide sits. Not very much, but just a little bit. So you may want to consider a small adjustment when that happens. You may well have also noticed that I've got some rear tyres on this car, or on this chassis. The rear tyres are the right size so that I'm getting a similar clearance on the rear of the car to how I would actually be racing it on the track. That's important because when you're setting your guide height, there is a slight tip in the chassis, and if the back of the chassis comes down, you tend to find that sometimes the guide can come up at the front. So setting your guide height would be sensible to do with tyres that are similar size to what you're going to be racing on. The other thing I also do is, once I've decided which washers I'm putting under my guide, I would always put my other two washers, so my 15 thou and my 5 thou, on top of the guide before I screw the guide nut down. That way, when I'm doing any adjustments of guide height, so now let's say, for example, I was coming to a track that had recessed braid, and I now needed to put in more washers. So I would take maybe the 5 thou off the top, put it underneath the guide plate, put my chassis back on, put my washer back on top, Then I could screw my guide nut down again, and this time the guide nut would always be sitting in the same place on the thread. Now that's important. If you'd watched again one of my other videos, that's quite important if you've actually set your guide nut up to match your guide. Just to show you the difference on another guide, here we are. I have a Cahosa guide. This one's quite old. I've been using this for a while. You can see the braids are well used. I've trimmed them down nice and short to trim off all the burnt ends. It's still usable on something like a low powered car like this, but let's just see how this one works out in terms of thickness. So you can see now I'm going to measure this more towards the front because I need to get to the thicker part of the braid, and the braids are shorter. So let's see what we are for thickness of that. 73 thou. Let's check it the other side. 71.5. So a couple of thou difference there. Slightly thinner than that guide. Again, if you're changing your braids or if you're getting an accident, all of that is going to affect your ride height at the front of your car. So they're all things that you have to consider when you're working out the best combination of ride height, chassis position, type of braid, etc. So in summary, there isn't a right answer for how you like the front of your car set up, but some general thoughts would be to work out the zero chassis height of your car. So that is where the front of your chassis or your front wheels sit on a block, nice and flat with the guide. And if everything was zeroed, then everything sits flat and lines up. Then from there, you can either add or remove washers to change the height of your guide. Raising the front of your chassis is useful for grippier tracks, perhaps when you want a slight bit more movement, or if the track's full of rubber or covered in rubber where you don't want to run your front wheels or your front of your chassis through the rubber that's built up on the track. But again, maybe lowering the front of the chassis if the track's nice and smooth and you want maybe ultimate grip from the chassis. Hope you enjoy watching. Please like, please subscribe. Hopefully this is useful for you, and I'll keep making videos. Thank you for watching.